Ladies and gentlemen, on the Russian Civil War. I've been commissioned to do a series on it, and I have a couple of books here. The Russian Revolution by Sheila Fitzpatrick, published in 1982, and then published in 1963 and updated a few times, A History of Russia by Nicholas V. Ryazanovsky. This one is my roommate's. I'm kind of lucky he had it, because I didn't have a large array of books on the Russian Revolution. Although I do have a very large array of books on Soviet Russia, for some reason my interests begin with Stalin. I've never been real interested in Lenin or before that. So I didn't have a lot of books applicable to that. But I do have some interesting material outlined here. I've learned more about the Russian Civil War than I knew before. So I'm glad I went through the project, and I think that you'll learn something about warfare generally if you follow along and listen to what's going on. Now let's set the stage briefly. In the early 1900s, Russia was considered the most backward of the European states, especially of the major states. And it was a massive area, lots of resources and wealth seemingly, but yet poor. The Soviets, the communists, spread the myth that the Tsarist days were days of famine and shortage and stuff, when actually Russia was a major grain exporter and had to import grain through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It imported grain, exported it in the 20s, but people starved to death. But that's a different part of the story. Russia used to export grain until the communists took over, and then it became a net importer for a long, long time. Until 1905, there were no political parties. There was no central elected parliament, and the autocracy had undiminished powers. So it was a really barbaric seeming state compared to the rest of Europe, which in one form or another had some kind of citizen control. I mean, the Magna Carta goes back to the 1200s. That's 700 years before this. Yeah. So before Russia gets some form of democracy or republicanism or representational government. And even then, what they established was called the Duma, or the House. Even then, they didn't have much power, and ultimately the Tsar stripped their power down, so it was nothing but the power to give him advice. They couldn't veto, and they couldn't even write legislation. So that's where we are. We're up to the 1905, when Russia gets a little bit of representational democracy. 1908, it's stripped of its powers. 1914 comes, World War I begins, and the Russian Civil War begins in 1917. But let's just talk for a second about 1914 and the World War I breaking out. Russia had a very, very difficult time fighting the Germans, and Germany wanted very much to get the Russians out of the war so that they could concentrate on the Western Front. So where Russia was struggling really, really hard with the battle, and the troops didn't have guns and they didn't have bread, the Tsars had done a terrible job of keeping up the military or advancing it in any way. The country was just too poor to support a very good military. So they had large numbers of troops, unequipped and essentially untrained. And there was therefore trouble in the ranks. The army was not loyal to the Tsar on some level, because they were just sick of it. The Tsar had no power and no wealth and wasn't taking care of the people as he's supposed to. Another meaning for the idea of Tsar in Russia is the little father, just slightly below God, like a saint on earth or something like that. And people were sick of the things not working out well. Now, as bad as that was, and society was just falling apart, and the Tsar just abdicated and melted away, as bad as that was, listen to this quote from page 11. This is Sheila Fitzpatrick, The Russian Revolution. After the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917, many Russian émigrés looked back on the pre-revolutionary years as a golden age of progress which had been arbitrarily interrupted by the First World War, or the unruly mob, or the Bolsheviks. So as bad as it was, they looked back on it as good times compared to what the Bolsheviks brought. And I've seen cartoons of 1905, 1915, 1925, 1935 of a shoe store, the front of a shoe store. In 1905, there's quite a bit of shoes in stock. 1915, there's even more. 1925, almost none. And 1935, it's boarded up, and there's a bum sleeping in front of it. That was in a book about the Russian economy, but I don't have it with me, and I have no clue who wrote it. It's a very good book, though. So, the Bolsheviks said afterwards that the economy had been in the dumps under the Tsars, and that it brought industrialization, when the opposite was true in large part. Now, the author points out that Russia industrialized late, and there's an advantage to that. And let me draw a parallel to modern Africa after I describe Russia. Russia didn't have electricity or anything right clear up to the early 1900s. They didn't have steel plants and stuff. So instead of working with the old technology, they were able to just bring in technology from the year 1900 and around to begin installing. When they began their modernization, they began with modern equipment. They didn't have to go through the 100 stages, or the 100 years of all the stages that Western technology had to go through. We're seeing that in Africa today, people have cell phones. They didn't have to go through all the pain of becoming an urban civilization and doing away with rural way of life and shutting down, the family farms of 50% of the population. They didn't have to go through all that. They just skipped right to having cell phones, some of them on their farm. And they've got automobiles, even though they never had to develop them. They never had to go through the horse and buggy stage and then drive Model Ts and then old 1950s Chevys with bad suspension that would fall off the road if there were bumps. They never had to drive all that. They can go right to modern 1990s and 2000 era automobiles and computing equipment and cell phones and so on. So if anyone thinks that we're taking advantage of the Third World, or that we were taking advantage of Russia and that's why they were poor, it's the opposite. They are actually benefiting massively from the fact that even though they were dragging their ass, as it were, eventually, when they decide to join the modern world, they've got this cornucopia of wealth and ideas that they can use. So we see Russia industrializing late and with the best technology available at the time, under the Tsars. And then that continues, of course, in the 20s and 30s with Stalin's modernization program. Now, since this is about the Russian Civil War, we're not going to spend a lot of time on World War I. We're going to skip 3 years up inside World War I to 1917, when the revolution happened. At this time, the Tsar had abdicated in favor of his brother, and his brother had abdicated in favor of the decision of the Duma, the House of Representatives. And then the Duma decided to have an election because they hadn't had a decision of who represents who since 1905 or 1907, very early on. And there were very, very limited numbers of people allowed to vote in that. So they said, we've got to do a new thing, we've got to have more people voting, and then we've got to decide what powers these people have. So they scheduled this and then rescheduled it and bungled around. And inside that time frame, the Bolshevik Soviet communists took over the government. And that is Act 1 of the Civil War, even though people say the Civil War begins once the communists have power and other armed groups start to oppose them. That's essentially the beginning of the Civil War. But the period between the abdication of the Tsar and the first shots fired in the proper Civil War is this shuffling and taking over by the Bolsheviks, by the communists, the Soviets. Shuffling and taking over and expanding their power and bullying, and that's what we're going to see a bit of now here. So now I'm going to quote from Nicholas Ryazanovsky, A History of Russia, page 455. The imperial regime died with hardly a whimper. Now, I want to pause on that sentence right there. We could take one word out and it would be the same